You know something? I love shark mouths. I bought this 48 scale Arma Airacobra because I wanted to make a plane with a shark mouth. And I'm a firm believer that an Airacobra ain't an Airacobra unless it's got one big old red and menacing shark mouth on it. But I bought the wrong kit. This is a later variant, and the box had no shark mouth decals. I even searched the internets to find some, but I struck out. So I decided to paint on my own shark mouth. And I decided to take a few risks and to try a few new things with this build. And you know something? It turned out pretty nice. Let me show you how I did it. I've never paid much attention to the P-39. I always thought it was so awkward looking with its car doors, the engine behind the pilot, and that stork-like front landing gear. I read somewhere about its poor performance and that it was relegated to lesser roles. Hell, they practically gave them away to the Soviets. So I dismissed it. But I was wrong. The Airacobra might not have been the high flyer of its generation, but it came into its own as a ground support airplane in the early stages of World War II, particularly in Guadalcanal, where its half-dozen machine guns saved countless lives. This here is the Arma P-39 Q kit that I got at my local hobby shop because I kept hearing so many good things about Arma models, and I had a decent experience building their Wildcat a few years ago. At the time I bought it, I just assumed there would be markings for a shark mouth version. Well, it turns out I probably should avoid making these assumptions in the future. The Q variant didn't seem to have a lot of shark mouths, which is a travesty if you ask me. But as I started snipping out the cockpit parts, I discovered something very interesting in these Arma sprues. They contain all of the necessary elements to backdate this plane to an N version, and there were plenty of those with shark mouths. I just had to swap out an engine cowl part, not install the gun pods, and use the wing guns. How nice of Arma to do that for me. That was really kind. But then, Arma did me one better with this little notice in the instructions about being able to download a free 3D print for cockpit pieces. What a great opportunity to use my new Elegoo Saturn 4 Ultra 3D printer. Now, I know what you're thinking. How on earth is a guy who can't even buy the right Airacobra kit going to be able to figure out a 3D printer? Which is probably the reason why Elegoo sent this to me. I mean, if this guy can figure it out and make nice 3D prints, well, pretty much everyone else can too. Downloading the print file from Arma was easy. Setting up the printer and the accessories was a breeze. And considering I have never printed anything before, I watched an intro video that explained the printer software and the entire process. Now, I might be dumb, but I'm not stupid. So before committing to the cockpit set, I tried a test print, which I cleaned and cured, and that seemed to work. So I went ahead and loaded up the cockpit file. I pressed the print button and let the machine do its magic. And well, here's what I got. 4 cockpit sets and a weird remnant from an earlier test print, which was weird, but it didn't seem to affect the cockpit parts. I scraped them off the build plate, I cleaned them off, and I cured them in the Elegoo curing station. And I'd say this was a success. The seats with the built-in harnesses looked great, as did the rest of the teeny little bits that came with the set. So there, point proven. Anyone can use these Elegoo printers. Now, truth be told, I was very intimidated by this thing at first, but I was able to figure it out quickly. I found the machine to be somewhat addictive and a little fun to use. The little intern has made me a list of things that she'd like, and I'm definitely looking forward to using this Brewster rack in a future Corsair build. So, knowing that the seat would be visible in the Airacobra cockpit, I really wanted the detail to be sharp. So I carefully painted the edges of the seat, I painted the seat belts, and I added a wash. I detail painted the buckles and all the metal bits on the harness. And the rest of the cockpit parts, once I snipped them, drilled them out, painted them, dry brushed them, added a wash, they all fit perfectly with the 3D printed parts. And I have to say, this cockpit was a pleasure to build. But of course, I couldn't help myself, so I drilled out the lens of the reflective sight and I used a Sharpie to create a new lens. I might have gone a little overboard with the chrome, but this was easily fixed with a little bit more black paint. Oh yeah, and of course I ruined the reflective glass, so I made my own out of very thin clear sheet. So here is the finished cockpit, and like I said, this is a real gem that fit together beautifully. And since so much of it will be visible on the finished model, it really pays to put some extra effort into this part. Fitting the cockpit into the model and getting the fuselage closed up was a bit of a challenge. After some dry fitting, I glued everything together, and I had to use tape and a clothespin to keep everything together while the glue dried. The result was not too bad, and the few gaps that there were closed with some styrene followed by some super glue. The top of the nose left some ugly gaps, but like the fuselage, these two were filled with styrene, sanded smooth, and the lost panel lines were rescribed using Dymo tape and my favorite scriber. Getting the wing pieces to fit together, well, that required a bit of plastic surgery. And then getting the completed wing assembly to properly mate with the fuselage required a little more nipping and tucking. But I did eventually get it to fit, and some more styrene and superglue filled the gaps. Once the Airacobra was together, I decided to work on some of the detail parts, starting with this propeller assembly. That cannon was nothing but a blob of plastic, and those props, yeah, they were looking a wee bit chunky. So I got to work thinning them down with a scalpel, especially the trailing edge and the thick middle section of each prop. To make the cannon, I found the thinnest tube of copper tubing that I could find at my hobby store, and I drilled it out with successively larger bits to thin the tube walls to make it look more cannon-like. To get the copper cannon onto the hub, I had to clip off that blobby cannon, and whoa, I never did find that bit again. It might have warped into another dimension. But then I sanded down the hub, and the middle was successfully drilled out with larger and larger bits. So here's the before and after shot, and there it is assembled, and later when the barrel is painted flat black and followed by a coating of pencil graphite. Next up were the wing guns. Yeesh. Again, nothing but plastic blobs screaming to be replaced. In this case, I used different gauges of hypodermic needles, one being slipped inside the other, and then I cut them to size using the original plastic part as a guide for how long to make them. They were also painted a flat black and given a nice coat of pencil graphite to make them look more like well-used guns. Then over to the exhaust stacks. And these were actually really nicely molded parts, and I could have probably just painted the ends black to simulate them being hollow, but nope. I drilled them all out. I used a needle to start the center hole, and then, as you guessed it, a couple of sizes of drill, and I hollowed out the ends. To paint them, I started with a base layer of aluminum, and I sprayed them with a thin mix of Nato black and Hull red to make a rusty patina of sorts. And then I followed that up with some Tamiya black Paneliner to deepen the holes and darken the rest of the part. So I think it's time we get this Airacobra painted. How about you? I started by masking the canopy with the mask that Arma supplied, and then I sprayed the interior green color first. This makes the interior of the canopy match the rest of the cockpit color. Now you'll notice some extra tape and liquid mask on the canopy, and that was insurance. A few of the canopy masks came in sections, so I wanted to be absolutely sure I was protecting the clear glass from the airbrush. My goal with this model was to get the plane to look sun-faded and worn, like the real thing was in the Pacific. And to do that, I started with a coat of Tamiya flat black over the entire model. Then I started marbling the bottom surfaces with Tamiya white acrylic paint. I'll leave a list of paints in the description of this video. This mixture was thinned more than usual so that I could turn down the pressure on the compressor and get close to the model. Now I do this freehand, but you can also get photo etch masks for this. The key is to make little tight random squiggles on all of the panels of the airplane. It can take a while to finish, but it's okay to be messy and imperfect. Actually, that is the ideal. You'll want to have randomness here. I continued the marbling on the upper surfaces of the model, and I used a couple of different colors. Flat white, flat gray, It really doesn't matter so long as it's a light color. If you want to get fancy, you can even get some buff or some flesh colors in there too. The idea is to break up the uniformity of the final coat of paint, so there are really no rules except to keep things tight and random. And this is the monstrosity I was left with. It's all random squiggles and splotches, and ooh, it is ugly, but it's supposed to be ugly. The next step was to tie it together with a top coat. The danger here is putting on too thick a top coat that will obliterate that nice marbling underneath, and there are two ways to lower this risk. The first is to use thinned paints. For the underside, I used Tamiya Sky Gray, and I thinned it to about 30 parts paint to 70 parts thinner. I turned up the compressor pressure somewhat to get a nice flow of air, and I have faster movements across the model while I build up the color. The second way to lower the risk is to walk away from the model. You see, right about the time when you're thinking, hey, have I put on enough paint? You've probably put on enough paint. So the best thing to do at that point is to put the airbrush down and maybe go for a walk or get a soft drink, watch a video, call a friend. It's up to you. And when you return to the model, you'll be looking at it with fresh eyes, and then you'll know whether to use another light coat or if it's just right. Remember, the goal here is to have just enough paint to make it look faded and marbled. The same procedure was used for the upper surfaces where I sprayed the Airacobra in Mr. Hobby Aqueous Olive Drab. And wow, do I ever like this color. Again, thin coats, faster airbrush movements, and being ready to walk away. Here's what I mean. The top coat here is almost there, but it could use another pass or two over the wing, and definitely in the nose area. All right, so now on to the fun part with this build. I made the mask using shark mouth artwork that I found online. Once I cleaned up the design using Microsoft Paint 3D, I loaded the file under the silhouette cutter, and you could just see the outline of the masks in this picture. The shark mouth is painted using 3 colors, and it is an exercise of painting one color at a time, then properly masking it, and then painting the next color. I find it easier to place a blank mask where I need the mouth to go. This makes placing the edge mask really easy. Once the edge mask was secured and the rest of the cowl was masked off, I could peel away the blank and get to work. I started with a thin coat of flat white mixed with a drop or two of Tamiya buff. This gave me a nice uniform surface to paint the red on the outside of the shark mouth. I faded the paint by mixing 2 parts Tamiya flat red to 1 part Tamiya deck tan. When the red was dry, I carefully masked the red bits of the shark mouth with pieces from my final mask, and then I used Tamiya tape to seal the edges. Then I sprayed a toned down flat white mixture for the teeth of the shark mouth. This was followed by the teeth masks, and then those edges were sealed with even more bits of Tamiya tape. And the last color that was sprayed, well, that was Tamiya Nato black. I did the eyes in the opposite way. I started with the black, then I masked and I sprayed the white mixture, and then after some very careful masking, I sprayed the red. And the moment of truth? Well, I'd say victory. Actually, I was really happy with how this turned out, except for this one little oops. Yeah, I guess I got a little crazy with the white, and some of it got under the mask. Luckily, this one was an easy fix. I just masked and sprayed that area to fix it. After that, I sealed everything with a gloss coat using Tamiya Clear, and I highlighted the panel lines using MIG Paneliner Wash. I absolutely love using this product. It's just the right amount of color and thinner, and the cleanup is easy with a dry cotton bud if you wait about 30 minutes or so. Now, I always try taking some risks with each build. This is the only way to get better at anything. So the first risk I took was to airbrush the exhaust staining. After studying many pictures of Airacobras in the wild, I saw a distinctive stain pattern in many of them. It seems to have been a light gray color, and it started mostly under the exhaust stacks and then gradually bent down and under the fuselage insignia. getting thinner and thinner as it went. To replicate this, I made a very thin mix of Tamiya medium gray paint. I practiced on a paint mule just to see the flow of the paint and how I could manipulate it. I figured the best way to do this was by making light passes, starting at the exhaust stack cavity, and then slightly pulling away from the model as I moved along the fuselage. Now, I did use very thin paint, so that even if I made like a small mistake, it would hardly be noticeable. I can't remember exactly how many passes I did, but I stopped when I could see a fairly sooty buildup starting at the exhaust cavity. The second risk I took was using pencils to simulate the chipping and scratching of the paint on the wing roots. Now, the first time I ever used a Prismacolor pencil, I used it all wrong. I went hog wild with the chipping, and I ultimately made my airplane look like it had a bad case of measles. That's the completely wrong approach, so I wanted to try this again. Looking again at the many reference photos of well-enjoyed Airacobras, I noticed a recurring wear pattern in the wing roots and up the sides of the airplane. As well, I also noticed that the rest of these airplanes may have been stained and dirty and sun-faded, but otherwise the paint was tough. There wasn't this flaking of paint chips all over these aircraft. What I wanted to do was wear away the black painted walking strips down to the base coat, and in some cases down to the primer, and others down to the bare metal. And I started by sharpening the pencils, and I practiced on a mule before committing to the Airacobra. As you can see, this was a combination of light taps to build up an area of wear, then filling in some parts where the wear was way down to the metal. I also used 3 colors of AK pencils to simulate the base color, primer, and worn anti-slip coating. I was still learning as I was going, but I found that the sharper the pencil and the lighter the touch, the more effective the result. The look that I was after was that of a rubbed and scuffed and scratched plane to the point where it gradually just wore off. Like painting the top coat, it also pays to take a break and walk away from the model in order to prevent pencil scratching madness. And I did that a few times until I was happy with the results. And after that, well, it was the usual details that had to be finished. I punched out some masks, and I painted the airplane's lights. I painted the wheels and the nose gear, and I added scratch-built brake lines to the landing gear. I drilled out and added wire reinforcement to the door hinges because, well, there was absolutely no other way to attach the doors to the fuselage. Lastly, I added the radio antenna using some Ushi line. And there you have it. One completed 48 scale Arma Airacobra. Not the easiest kit in the world to build, but I am happy with how the painted shark mouth turned out. I also think I had success with my exhaust stains, and I was pleasantly surprised by how well the pencils worked this time. I'll definitely be experimenting more with them in the future. Thank you for watching to the end of the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, keep building, keep taking risks. You might actually surprise yourself, and you'll definitely get better.